guys, this is Jessica and Noam here at Rax Tracks for another episode of What's That Sound? Today we are looking at the drum sound of Cherub Rock by the Smashing Pumpkins.
Jimmy Chamberlin is the drummer. It was produced by Butch Vig. It was mixed by Alan Moulder. It's kind of quintessentially 90s, but also doesn't sound like anything else. Let's figure it out.
For our drums today, we used our vintage 70s Gretsch kit, a Jimmy Chamberlin signature Yamaha snare, and for our cymbals we have K-Dark 14-inch hi-hats, 19-inch K-Dark thin crash, and then for our ride cymbal we have a 21-inch A-Suite ride. And Noam will get into this later, but we also sampled another snare, and that is the Ludwig Supraphonic.
All right, so there's some obvious challenges with dealing with the arrangement of the song, which the arrangement of the song is 100 guitars going through big muffs and going through Marshall 800 stacks, right? That is an enormous sound, and in order to make sure that we're cutting through that and also leaving room for the vocals, we have to tailor the drum EQ very, very specifically. We want to have a nice big bottom. We want to have a really bright top, right? Brighter than you would expect at the time. And we want to have a lot of mid-range. And then the thing that we don't want to have is a lot of the frequencies that these guitars tend to build up on, which is like 300, 500, 700, all these things we're kind of scooping a little bit out of the drums so that the guitars can kind of breathe in those frequencies and the drums can cut through with the higher frequencies. So there's a couple clues that we were able to get by listening to this recording, right? To figure out what parts of these sounds were coming from which microphones and things like that. A big clue was that the snare drum was really, really mono in this, right? There was not a ton of width to it. It's really, really focused, really, really centered. That is partially for the sake of the arrangement, because with all the guitars, those guitars are all wide, and so if we have this snare drum just super, super mono, there's separation between them and it can cut through a little easier. The other thing that we notice is that the cymbals are not super prevalent, right? They're pretty pushed back. The only way to do that is to have the overheads pretty quiet, right? And to not use a ton of room mics, because room mics also have a lot of cymbals. So we knew that a lot of our snare drum was gonna come from the snare itself. We could not rely on the overheads to like shape the sound of the snare. The last thing that we noticed is that the hi-hat is fairly centered in this recording. It's not super loud, right? But it is fairly centered, right? And what that tells me is that likely most of the hi-hat sound is coming from the snare drum itself. So any moves that we did to the snare drum, we have to be really conscious of what that's doing to the hi-hats. If we turn up the overheads too much, the hi-hat starts to spread out and starts to move over to like the left side of the drummer, which is where it was. We don't want that. We just want the snare to be centered. So we are gonna watch out how much of our overheads we get to use on this recording. Kick drum, super, super basic. We just used an RE20. This was like very popular at the time. It is a classic kick drum sound. We had thrown up also a FET 47, which was like another classic kick drum sound at the time. The kick drum tends to get a little bit longer with the FET 47. For the snare drum, because we knew that we were not going to use the overheads that much, we had to make the snare drum a well-rounded sound on its own. Oftentimes, if you record like rock drums, The snare drum mic itself is not as bright as the sound is in the recording, right? And that's because part of the high end of the snare drum comes from the overheads. When you brighten up the cymbals, it also brightens up the snare drum, and you could kind of use that to your advantage. In this situation, we knew that we didn't have that, right? So we had to add something to make sure that we have this natural high end on the snare drum. To do that, we taped a 57 and a AKG 451 together. The 57 is like classic mid-range, normal snare drum. The 451, it is a really hi-fi condenser microphone, right? Small diaphragm condenser. You have to pad it down because it has to be padded in order to be that close to a drum. But what it ends up having is a little bit more low end, a little bit more high end, and a little bit less mid-range than the 57. If you play them each alone, they kind of sound like half of a drum sound, right? And when you play them together, it feels like the drum sound is complete. The things that you have to watch out for is phase. You have to make sure that the capsules are perfectly aligned, and you have to make sure that they are exactly the same distance from the snare itself. So sometimes I'll see people like stick the 451 on top. I find that the phase to be a little bit less coherent that way because the 451 ends up being a little bit further away, the capsule, than the 57. So side by side, the sound gets to them at exactly the same time, and they really reinforce each other, and we make sure that they don't pull away any frequencies from each other. To round out the sound, we added a 414 on the bottom just to add that extra length on the snare drum. What we can do is compress that 414 really, really heavily, and we can add a bunch of length to the snare drum by adding length with compression, and we can avoid adding a ton of hi-hat to that, right? Because the bottom snare, it has a lot of snare, it does not have a lot of hi-hat in it. Let's check them all out together. For the toms, we kept it really basic. Sennheiser 421s, classic tom sound going through Neve preamps. We did a little bit of EQ, we scooped out a little bit of 500 on them, we added a little bit of top end, and we filtered everything below about 80 hertz because we didn't really need that much low end in these toms. And we also added a little bit of boost at 100 hertz just to add a little extra impact. For our overheads, we're using AKG 414 condenser microphones. These had the pads on, these had filters on, and we knew that we did not want a lot of low end coming from these, right? This, again, all of the width of this drum sound needed to be thin. Because we're gonna have a ton of guitars on the left and right sides, anything that was gonna be wide had to not have a lot of low end and not a lot of like low mids, right? So we took our overheads, we added some brightness to them, and we scooped out a bunch of 100 hertz, like everything below 100 we kind of shelved down, and we scooped out a bunch of like 300 hertz just to get a really thin sound that's like mostly just cymbals. So here's just that. For the room sound, we're using Coles 4038s. These are dark, really big microphones. However, we knew that we were going to use very little of them, so we spaced them out kind of wide, and we're just going to add them in for energy. We recorded two versions of these microphones. We split them out, and we recorded an uncompressed version, and we recorded a compressed version that was compressed with a Chandler TG1. Between these two versions, we were considering picking one or the other, and we ended up just blending them together. It ended up just being parallel compression. The compressed version has a bunch of extra energy, and then the uncompressed version, the drums themselves are way louder than like the cymbals and the room sound. So together, they kind of add just a little bit of energy to this drum sound on the sides. So our reverb, we used a Valhalla room reverb. The peculiar thing about this was that we were noticing in the drum sound that the reverbs felt like they're mono. Like there's this length to the snare drum, and it's a mono length, right? Again, so many guitars on the sides that they felt like they had all this real estate for things to kind of breathe in the middle. And so we took a Valhalla reverb, it's a stereo reverb, we panned it centered, and we stuck it just below the snare drum so that it kind of adds just length to the snare drum, and they're kind of more connected almost than they would be if we had it stereo. They feel like one thing rather than two separate things. So Butch Vig has been pretty generous with information from a lot of his work, but from this era. And one thing that he mentioned was that Alan Moulder was using samples on this record. Now, if you listen to the record in the intro, you'll notice that there's no samples, right? And the snare drum is natural. And when the heavy guitars come in, all of a sudden a texture gets added to the snare drum. It kind of sounds like a gunshot or something, right? It is a mono sample, and it's not super prevalent, right? Like it's not like a modern metal record or something where like it would be 80% sample and like 20% actual drum. This is 70% actual drum, 30% sample, but it's definitely a part of the sound. To get it today, rather than just having a sample, we decided to record our own samples in the same room and just swap out the drum for something that has a little bit more of a shotgun sound to it. So we took our 6.5-inch snare drum, we opened up the snare so that it had a really long ring to it. We recorded it with a ton of room mics, way more room mics than we were using in the normal drum sound. And we panned all those room mics centered so that, again, we did not get separation between this sound and the snare drum. The sound of this shotgun snare combined with a mono reverb sound, combined with the direct mics, they all kind of meld together into this really long, cool, energetic snare. And if we had them all stereo, you would be able to decipher which things are contributing to different parts of that sound. Mono, it all melds together. So we recorded that sample, we printed it down, mixed it, and then loaded up into Slate Trigger and just used our direct mics as a triggering device so that we could lay samples of this snare drum that we recorded every time the snare drum hits. So let's check that out. We recorded some ridiculously distorted, license-free guitars to put on top of it. Let's listen to that. That was Cherub Rock by Smashing Pumpkins.
We hope you enjoyed it, and please let us know in the comments what other songs you would like to hear us break down. We'll see you next time.